This bowl is made from a human skull. For centuries, that was not the strange part. Across the Tibetan world, practitioners and monasteries kept bowls like this one, mounted in silver, sometimes set with turquoise or coral, used openly in daily meditation, not hidden away in shame. The skull was not a trophy taken from an enemy. It was not a curse, and it was not meant to frighten anyone who saw it. It belonged to one of the strangest practices Buddhism ever produced. One that began, according to tradition, with a woman sitting alone in a graveyard, preparing to give away the one thing everyone is taught to protect above all else: her own body. By the 11th century, Tibetan Buddhism had absorbed centuries of tantric teaching from India, and death was not something this tradition tried to avoid. It was something it studied closely. Meditators sought out cremation grounds on purpose, places considered unclean, places where, according to local belief, restless spirits and hungry ghosts lingered after dark, and where wrathful protected deities were said to gather. Fear, faced directly, was treated as a teacher rather than something to escape. One practice that grew out of this world spread across the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism and even into Bon, a religious tradition that has coexisted alongside Buddhism in Tibet for centuries. Its name was Chöd. The word means roughly to cut or to sever. At its center was a bowl made from a human skull, and a woman who became, by most accounts, one of the very few people in Tibetan history to found a major lineage of teaching in her own right. Her name was Machig Labdrön. Machig Labdrön was born in Tibet in the 11th century. As a child, she was trained to recite the Prajnaparamita Sutras, long Buddhist texts focused on emptiness and the nature of reality. And according to traditional biographies, she could recite long passages from memory before she fully grasped what they meant. She studied under several teachers, including, by some accounts, an Indian master associated with a movement called Jije, or pacification. She married, had children, and at some point chose a more solitary path. What she developed from her training became known as Chöd, not a new philosophy, but a new way of putting an old one into direct embodied practice. The underlying idea was already old by her time. Buddhist thought had long held that the self people cling to so tightly does not exist the way they imagine it does. The fear of losing that self, however, is very real, and it shapes almost everything a person does, often without them noticing. Chöd did not try to argue this point with words. It tried to confront it directly, in the one place where the fear lives most strongly, the body. And within a few generations, the practice had spread from her own students to monasteries across the Tibetan plateau. In its traditional form, a Chöd practitioner travels to a place chosen to provoke fear, a cemetery, a site associated with violence, a remote crossroads after dark. There, the practitioner sits down, plays a small drum and bell, and begins a visualization. In the imagination, their own body is cut apart piece by piece and transformed into nectar, into a vast feast spread out across the landscape. In many versions of the practice, the feast is then offered, in a specific order, to different kinds of guests. First, to enlightened beings, as an act of devotion. Then to protective spirits, as a kind of thanks. Then to beings still suffering in lower states of existence, as an act of compassion. And finally, last, and on purpose, to the beings the practitioner fears most, the obstacle makers, the creditors of old debts, real or imagined. Nothing is held back for the self. It is important to be precise here. The practice is visualization, not action. No one is harmed, and nothing physical happens to the practitioner's body. What is given away exists only in the mind of the person giving it. But in this tradition, the mind is exactly where the problem lives, and exactly where it has to be addressed. To support the visualization, practitioners used real ritual instruments: a small hand drum, a bone trumpet, and, at the center of it all, a bowl. That bowl was the Kapala, typically the upper portion of a human skull, cleaned and then mounted by craftsmen in silver or gilded bronze. Some were left plain. Others were elaborate, set with coral and turquoise, resting on a stand shaped like a tripod of skulls or stylized flames. Tradition holds that not every skull was considered suitable, although accounts vary widely and much about the practice's history remains uncertain. Traditional sources describe various ideas about what made a skull auspicious, particular markings, particular shapes of the bone, though these criteria differed across texts and periods. Alongside the Kapala, practitioners sometimes used a Kangling, a trumpet made from a human thighbone, and a damaru, a small drum that in some traditions was made from two skull caps joined together at the crown. To modern eyes, objects like these can look like instruments of horror. Within the tradition, they were closer to the opposite. They were reminders that the body each person guards so carefully will, one day, belong to no one. That it might become an object, a bowl, an instrument, or nothing at all. Chöd, to cut, was never really about the body. The body was simply the easiest thing to point at. What practitioners were trying to cut was attachment. Attachment to comfort, to safety, to the idea of a fixed, permanent self that had to be protected at all costs. In Buddhist terms, this attachment is called clinging, and it is treated as the root of most suffering. By imagining the body given away completely, to friendly forces and hostile ones alike, a practitioner rehearses a kind of letting go that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The Kapala often sat at the center of that rehearsal, not as a symbol of death for its own sake, but as proof that the rehearsal was not just an idea. Someone's skull had already made this journey, from a living person to an object to a tool used by someone else entirely. In some regions of Tibet, bodies were offered after death directly to vultures on high platforms, in a practice often called sky burial. The body became food, plainly and visibly, within hours of death. Chöd asked practitioners to make that same offering in advance, while still alive, not with their actual bodies, but with their resistance to the idea. What was once mine had become useful. What had once been a self had become a bowl. Chöd is still practiced today by monks and lay people in monasteries and increasingly far from Tibet. Many contemporary practitioners perform it in far more ordinary settings. A quiet room is enough. The setting changed. The exercise did not. Some modern teachers and researchers have pointed to practices like this when discussing how people relate to fear and mortality more generally, though how directly the comparison holds is still debated. The Kapalas that remain, in monasteries, in museums, in private collections, were never meant to preserve anything. They hold no ashes, no relics, no piece of the person they came from. What they held, every time they were used, was a question. What would it feel like to give all of this away, completely? The bowl outlives the answer. It outlives the person who first asked. What remained was never the body. It was the willingness to let it go. That is kept.